Okay, so now you should be seeing my slides and not just my face. So just a quick heads up. Since this is a graduate seminar, so it was mostly aimed at PhD students, even though they are not only PhD students. I'm happy if you are a PhD student online, or I'm happy to take questions of clarification during my presentation. So I tried to be rather clear on some of the basic concepts and frameworks, but if there's anything that's not clear to you, don't hesitate to stop me during presentation. Well, also if you're not a PhD student, of course, just don't hesitate to stop me during presentation and ask me if there's anything that's not clear. So as Filippo has said, the title of my presentation is Perception-Based Mind Reading, and I will explain in due time what I mean by that. And I would like to start just from an intuitive scenario. Well, here we are mostly online, so I'll just ask you to imagine a case where you're going to a party and you don't know anyone. So you're scanning the room because you're looking for someone you could talk to. And intuitively, you don't need to think or to reflect or to make inferences to have what seems to be a perceptual experience of some of the social features, broadly speaking, of the people present in the at the party in the room. So I'm using a painting as an example. You might immediately have the experience that someone is happy, but someone might be more in a melancholic mood. Maybe you can also have the experience that two people are in love, or that someone is maybe less interested in the other person. You might also see some of their character traits. Maybe someone look introverted, someone look extroverted, and so on. So intuitively, so this is still at the level of intuition, it seems to us that in some cases, we have an immediate perceptual experience of some traits in people, which you can call very broadly social traits. Why are social traits? Because these are traits that we can use then in social cognition, which is broadly the domain dedicated to the study of how we interact with each other. So we can use these perceptual experiences to interact with others, as well as to interpret their behaviors, and then also to mind read them. Now, the main idea or the main aim of my talk is to make this intuition a bit more precise. So you might agree with me on this kind of intuitive example, but you would still would like to have a more fleshed out theory of how perception, which is not obviously social, could nevertheless play a role in mind reading, and I'll define what mind reading is in a bit, and social cognition more in general. So in the first part of my talk, I will introduce this heuristic notion that can be called social perception and explore some of social perception features. Then I will focus on one consequence of the existence of social perception on mind reading. And the consequence is that if social perception is perception, then it contains patterns of error that are characteristic of perception, namely perceptual illusions. And then, and this is something that's relatively new, and it was not in the abstract, but I will apply the framework sketch in the first part to try to explain some puzzling features of our interactions with artificial agents. Okay, so let me begin by trying to sketch, first of all, that I mean by social perception. And since I was trying to give you a bit of a big picture to the beginning, I'll just start a bit far afar, and when I'll zoom in, in the main topic of my approaches of social perception. And I will start with this guy, René Descartes. So as in many parts of philosophy of mind, René Descartes is also responsible for a form of skepticism, which is a skepticism about our ability to know that our people have mental states similar to ours. So in the second meditation, in the metaphysical meditations, René Descartes is looking outside a window and he's watching people going back and forth. And he asks this following question: how do I know that these people are real people with, like thoughts and emotions, and not just automata or mechanical devices that are moved by some mechanism and that are just covered by, his expression, hats and capes? And this is why I use the stitch by Rodin of Balzac as an illustration, because there is nothing that, according to Descartes, guarantees that other people have similar mental states to ours. They might just have similar behaviors, but we cannot infer from behaviors their mental states. So there is a bit of a historical debate about whether really Descartes formulated the problem of our minds, but I can bracket this aside. And in the 20th century, especially starting from Bertrand Russell's discussion of the problem of other minds in the problems of philosophy, this problem has been introduced as a skeptical problem. So as I said, how do we know that other beings possess the mental states like we do? Because we can introspect our mental life, but we cannot introspect the mental life of others. And why do I start from this problem, which is an epistemological and skeptical problem? Because perception has been used as a solution to this problem. So there is already a tradition of appealing to perception as a way of solving the skeptical problem of other minds, based on the idea that we can perceive, so we don't need to infer or to reason upon, the private mental experiences of others. Now, in the framework of the epistemological problem of our minds, the perceptual solution has taken many versions that are as different as the one introduced by John McDowell from the one introduced by Fredericksky, so I'm not going to go into details at all. I just want to say that there is a rich history of appeals to perception as a way to uncover what's going on in the mental life of others. So my focus is not epistemological, but it is rather descriptive. I work mostly in philosophy of mind rather than in epistemology, but nevertheless, there is a connection between these two issues. And when I say that my focus is descriptive, what I mean is that I'm really interested in understanding the role that perception plays in our attempts to understand others, which is what has been called mind reading in a more technical term, which refers to our ability to attribute mental states to agents in order to make sense of their behaviors and explain their behaviors and interact with them. So the question really is, on a descriptive level, what role does perception play in mind reading, that is in our attempts to understand that others? And saying that perception might play an important role in mind reading is not trivial. And it is not trivial because it is not clear how perception, and this is a problem that was already common to perceptual solutions to the problem of other minds, how perception can track, represent, or make present an experience, something that is not present in view, but it is in a certain sense hidden from what we can directly experience. So one way of framing the possibility that perception could play a role in mind reading and social cognition is by claiming that perception could go beyond that has been traditionally assigned to its contents. In a more traditional account of perception, what we usually think is that, well, what actually philosophers have suggested, some people appeal to John Locke and his theory of primary secondary qualities as the ancestor of this view, is that the only properties that can be represented in perception are the so-called low-level properties. So if you focus on the image it's on my left, so I'm not really sure it's probably on your right, the idea would be that the contents of perception are limited to colors, shapes, orientations, shades, and so on. So intuitively visible low-level properties, that these properties impinge on the retina and are, in this simple sense, visual. Now, if you want perception to be social or just more broadly rich, what we need to do is to argue that the reach of perceptual content can go beyond low-level properties. And it can represent more complex properties that are not obviously visual, such as, for example, being a natural scene, or being a fruit, being a fig, being a pomegranate, or being absent, for example, the absence of oranges, or in the more social case, maybe the action of the person in front of us, or even the intention, such as I want to eat or I want to take a steak, could be already represented in perceptual content. And as I said, this is not obvious, because of course, there is nothing intuitively visible about these types of higher level properties. But, and I'll clarify this a bit more in a minute, I'm not going to argue in favor of rich content viewer perception. This is something that I've done in the past, but the main reason is that if you look at the literature on the social contents of perception, we have a rather long list of case studies that, by abduction, if you want, warrant the introduction of the label social perception. So as I will say in a moment, I would like to explore rather the consequence of introducing social perception as part of the rich perceptual content view. And these case studies are very varied, so I'm going to present you at least more as a way of convincing you what we already have. Interesting case studies of social perception. For example, perception of agents and people as opposed to objects and inanimate entities, perception of agency in general, and I'll focus on this in a little while, perception of emotions or emotional expressions, perception of intentions and or of goal-directed actions, perception of socially constructed kinds, such as someone's gender or someone's race, or maybe even someone's social category, perception maybe of personality and character traits, such as someone being introverted or extroverted, someone being trustworthy or untrustworthy. And this is something that is not just in the case of vision, but it is also has been studied in the case of audition, more recently in olfaction, and likely in multimodal perception as well. So, of course, someone who is a skeptic might argue that one of these cases is not a good case, or that maybe we are trying to lump together cases that are very different from them. But as I said, this is more of an abductive project. If we agree that these are good candidate cases for the contents of rich social perception, then we would be interested in exploring the consequence of their existence. Now, I want to make a bit more of a technical point right now. So if you are not really into the weeds about the debate, it might not be that interesting for you. I'm still going to make it because I want to be really clear about the scope of a claim. But if it's not clear to you, we can, of course, discuss it in the Q&A. But just for precision's sakes, I wanted to make this a bit more technical point before continuing the discussion. So saying that perception can be rich and social can be interpreted in different ways. So when we talk about social perception, there is an opposition, if you want, between two positions. Both these positions are cases of rich perceptual content, but they differ in the extent of the richer perception. So how far can perception go? So according to the more, let's say, rich or extreme position, in seeing an emotional expression of a face, so like I'm smiling, you're not just seeing an expression of happiness. You're seeing directly the hidden mental state that is behind, in a certain sense, the emotional expression. So these views are usually inspired by phenomenological approaches, and they are based off that can be called the constitutive argument on the ontology of emotions. So emotions are constituted by the facial and bodily expressions. So they're not something separate from them. And so according to this view, we do not just see emotional expressions, we directly see the mental state, which is the affective state with an intentional object, so the emotion that is of the same type ontologically as the emotional expressions in the face and body. So usually, so one of the proponents of this view is Dan Zahavi, others are Søren Overgaard and Joel Kruger, and they often appeal to the iceberg metaphor. So when you see an iceberg, of course, you just see the top of the iceberg, whereas the rest is submerged. But they use the analogy to say that the expression, the emotional expression of face and body is like the top of the iceberg, whereas the emotion is the hidden part, but it's just more of the same. Now, this is something that I have discussed a bit more in the past, so I don't want to go into all the details about this debate now. So I don't know if Ariana is online, but I sent you a paper which focuses on this debate. And the type of rich social perception that I endorse is, in a sense, less ambitious than the direct perceptual approach, because we can see the emotional expression, which is not just a collection of low-level properties. So it is an emotional expression of happiness or of sadness or of disgust and so on, but it is not the emotion itself. So there is still an ontological difference between the affective state and the bodily and facial expression. But there is nevertheless a connection, and this is maybe a bit too technical, but the connection is broadly inspired by Fred Dretski's notion of primary seeing as opposed to simple seeing. So the idea would be is that our visual state or perceptual state tracks the affective state by representing the emotional expression in the content. But the affective state is not directly represented in the perceptual content. I will come back a bit later on very briefly to this idea of tracking. But as I said, this is something that I wanted to present just to be a bit more clear on the scope of the claim. But you can also just ignore it, and the entire presentation can still work even if you don't pay attention to this more technical part. So, of course, claiming that we perceive mental states, social categories, personality traits, as I said, it's not obvious. And what we need is a set of criteria for distinguishing between what can be called properly perception or perceptual process, and that's not perception, which is broadly post-perceptual processing or cognition. So the problem here is how to draw the line, how to draw the frontier between perception and cognition. And usually the inference to the claim that some high-level property is perceived is introduced as an inference of the best explanation. Because we might not have sufficient necessary conditions on what constitutes perception. Well, some people think that there are necessary and sufficient conditions such as net block, but usually this is more of a an abduction, so an inference to best explanation. Nevertheless, there might be some features that are more central to perception than they are to cognition. For example, some form of information encapsulation, the speed and accuracy of treatment, absence of voluntary control, maybe stimulus dependence, and so on. So in the rest of the talk, as I said, I'm not going to take a definite stance on that concept of perception. Nevertheless, I will use some of the more maybe consensual criteria of what counts as a perceptual process in order to explore the impact of social perception on our cognitive lives. And so this is something that I already mentioned, but I'm not going to focus on showing what we have cases of social perception, because this is something that has been done by many people, and I also have done it in the past. And I want rather to take it for granted, but we have some cases of social perception and explore the consequence of this thing. So if someone is completely opposed to the existence of rich perceptual content in general and of social perception in particular, you can just take it as a conditional claim. If there are cases of social perception, perception of emotional expressions, of personality traits, of agency, of intentions, and so on, what is their impact? And the main consequence, I will argue, is that if we take social perception seriously, this implies accepting that it exhibits patterns of error characteristic of perception, which include social perceptual illusions. So yes, so just to mention very briefly for people who just arrived, I'm happy to take clarificatory questions during the talk, and you can also ask them in Italian. I mean, like so far it was a bit of an introduction, so I mean, like some pieces of a puzzle might be missing, but nevertheless, if from now on you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I'll be happy to take them also to kind of fill you in from about what has been said before, so I can like follow the presentation a bit better. I speak Italian, just I'm not used to giving presentations in Italian, so but I can answer in Italian as well if you need to ask a question. I'll hesitate. So as I said, the main consequence of the existence of social perception is that if social perception is a case of perception, like any other case of perception, we have specific patterns of error, including perceptual illusions. So these are perceptual illusions with social context. And if we have social perceptual illusions, these illusions as errors can carry on into the mind reading systems. So in a way, perception is a double-edged sword in mind reading. So sometimes it might be that in some sense, as the defenders of the direct social perception claim say, it can put us in a more direct contact with some social properties of others. But in our cases, on the other hand, it puts a kind of a veil of perceptual illusions between us and another. So in order to do this, I will start just from the normal case. So this is a non-social case, which is due to one of the maybe essential features of the perceptual process. And this is the feature that perception is in some sense isolated from information that's outside the perceptual process. Okay, so if you watch this picture, what do you see? So the question is not what do you know, but really what do you see? So you perfectly know that arms are not that long. So what you know is that there are two people with their arms extended. But what you see is one soccer player with a really long arm. Now, Of course, the property of information encapsulation is itself controversial, so I'm working with a rather loose notion here. The idea here is that encapsulated mental processes typically do not take into account information outside the process itself. So they are automatic, mandatory, and close to external influence. So your knowledge that arms are not that long still cannot change your perceptual experience. So some have argued very forcefully, especially Jerry Fodor in his Moderati of Mind 1983, that perception is a paradigmatic model process. We might not want to buy all the features of models as Fodor has introduced them, but we still could accept that perceptual experience, maybe not all of it, but at least part of our perceptual experience is indeed information encapsulated in the sense of being close to external influence, for example, from other mental processes. And non-social cases, so other non-social cases are rather famous examples of perceptual illusions, which are used by defenders of information encapsulation as a proof that perception is indeed information encapsulated. So, for example, in the Ebbinghaus illusion, which is on my left, probably on your left as well, if you're in the public, maybe in your right. I don't know. I'm confused I'm just confusing my left and right. So it doesn't matter. So the image with the circles, the two circles in the middle, the orange one, as you probably know, they are the same size versus diameter, but nevertheless, you still perceive them as being different. And similarly, on the checkboard, the cases A and B are actually the same color, but you still experience them being from different color because of the context in which you're presented. And once again, what's characteristic of perceptual illusions is no matter how much you know, even if you measure them, you cannot change your visual experience. So these are cases of classic perceptual illusions. So now the question is, are there perceptual illusions in social perception? So are there perceptual illusions with social contents in some of the signs? And I'm going to present a few intuitive cases before moving to two case studies that I think are particularly interesting in this context. And then I will try to distinguish perceptual illusions from different patterns of error in perception. So the first intuitive case of what could be a perceptual illusion in social perception is the phenomenon of pareidolia, which is a phenomenon of seeing faces in objects that are not real faces. This is something that has been described by Leonardo da Vinci, who actually even invites his students to look for these patterns in artificial stimuli, like in clouds or in some decorative patterns on a stucco. So if you look at this plug, so one is a US plug, the one I don't remember from which country it is, but you have an immediate experience of as if you're seeing a face with an emotional expression. And of course, these are not real faces, but nevertheless, this is what's called pareidolia. So the tendency of seeing face-like stimuli as faces as soon as you see them. A second example is a rather famous set of studies done in the 70s by a psychologist on the perception of biological motion. And here, what the studies show is that you can, in perception, so without thinking, distinguish between mechanical, mechanistic, non-animated, non-biological motion and biological or lifelike movements. So I don't know if you have seen this displayed, so I'm going to show one snippet to you. And what I'm going to ask you is to pay attention to the moment where you stop seeing the movement of a moving light as a mechanistic movement, and you start seeing it as a biological movement. So let me try hoping that it works. Yes, it starts somewhere. Okay, so apologies. It's It used to work on my laptop, but yeah, it might be slow. So the video is embedded in the slide, so it's not a link, but it might take a bit of time. So it's always a bad sign when you see a rotating image. Yeah, and this is asocial perception because it doesn't collaborate with your intentions. So if it keeps on moving, well, I'll just skip it, and I can share the slides. And if you're interested, you can have a look at it on your own, in the comfort of your own. Okay, so it's even worse than I thought. Yeah, let's just wait. It's terrible when you have to describe something that should be phenomenologically striking, because when you describe it, it's really not the same thing. I can just close PowerPoint and start it again. Yeah, I think it's better. Yeah, I'll just QD and let me. I'll try just one last time to see if it works. If it doesn't, yeah, I'll try. No, it seems that it's probably the video is too heavy for this laptop. Yeah, so it's not working. Okay, so yeah, I'll just close again. I apologize. You'll have to imagine everything that I'm describing. Yes, but I didn't put the link, so let's start it again. And as I said, once you have access to this live on the internet, you can have a look on your own. Let's keep that. And so these are where, well, some of them more intuitive than others. A few prima facie cases that you have perceptual illusions with social contents in this broad sense. Illusions of seeing a face, illusions of seeing biological motion. Now, what are these illusions? Of course, when you see a real face, like I'm looking at you, I'm seeing real faces. So these are not illusions. But when you're looking at artificial stimuli that are face-like, it's an illusion because you're not really tracking a face. And similarly for biological motion. So these video I failed to show you, what you see are actually psychologists moving point-like figures, which are not real people, but they are made out of lights. And your visual system is able to distinguish between a figure moving in a mechanistic way and a figure moving in a biological way, like a living being. And so this suggests that social perception, if it's perception, is information encapsulated because you can't prevent yourself from seeing some of these features as exemplifying social properties. And I think that there are two case studies that are probably a bit more precise and that can have a clear impact on the mind reading as a source of errors in mind reading. And these two case studies are, the first case studies is experience of agency. And the second case study is the experience of character and personality traits from faces, which can be called illusory perceptual first impressions of others. Now, the second slide I'm going to show you, so the next slide also contains a video. So now I'm afraid of clicking on it. I'll try nevertheless, because I know that this video is not as heavy as the first one. Okay, so this one is working. So the idea here is that if you're looking, so this is a series of experiments done by Gao and Charles and colleagues at Yale. So these are geometrical figures that, of course, don't have intentions and don't have mental states. But nevertheless, the type of perceptual experience that you have, which is triggered by the stimuli, gives you the impression of these like geometrical figures as chasing the ball. So it's an experience of directionality chasing intentionality. And in the second video, which is much more ancient, it's a topical experiment done by Heider and Zimmel in 1944. These are also geometrical figures. But when we exhibit some perceptual cues, you're experiencing them as having animacy, as having intentions, as having mental states. So you don't experience them as being purely mechanistic entities. Even though, of course, they're not entities with mental states. And so you see them as having desires or having intentions, so on. So, of course, the experiments by Gao and colleagues are inspired by this more ancient experiment. So I'm not going to show you the entire video, but you can also have a look at home if you want. And what's really characteristic of these displays is how compelling they are. So no matter what you believe, you still have this type of experience in seeing them up. And the second case study is not about agency, it's about having a visual experience of people's faces. So imagine encountering someone you don't know anything about, because this is the first time you see this person. And we also know from social psychologists that as soon as you see someone's face, you have an experience of that face's, some of that face's character traits. So you probably, well, some people online, I know that they've seen it already, especially Joulia, but for those who have never seen it, there is a consensus among subjects that the face on the left looks least trustworthy, whereas the face on the right looks most trustworthy. And there is a consensus. Of course, I mean, these are faces generated by a software. So these are not real people. These are artificial stimuli. So there is no fact of a matter about whether I'm being trustworthy or not. But imagine seeing someone with, let's say, the face on the right, and having the experience of maybe not trustworthiness per se, but niceness or cuteness and so on. But even here, it's very much unclear that just a visual experience would track some character traits in others, which are much more complex dispositional traits, such as being nice or being trustworthy. So we have perceptual experiences with rich social contents. For example, in this case, contents about some character traits in people. And in some cases, these are not perceptual experiences that correctly represent that trait in the other, but these are akin to or similar to perceptual illusions. Because, well, this is it's like kind of intuitive, unless you think that some people show the true character on their faces. Maybe, I don't know, but this is more folk wisdom. But intuitively, there is no deep connection between just having a round face and being really nice. And why are these? So not all cases of thinking about people's character traits are perceptual, of course. What's really characteristic of these experiments is how fast we are and the resistance to information outside the perceptual experience. Now, so these cases suggest that even in a social case, we have social mirror layers, so social perceptual illusions. And what makes an illusion is that there is a systematic disconnection between the conscious perceptual experience and how things are in the world. So a systematic disconnection between the conscious experience and reality. So what does it mean, systematic? It means that there is no reliable link between perceptual contents and the worldly property. So seeing some movements as movements of agents with intentions, in the case of a Wolfpack effect, does not track any real-world agentivity or intentionality. Seeing a round face as trustworthy does not track a real-world property of being trustworthy. And what makes them more solutions is that they are phenomenologically vivid. So there is something it is like, to use Nagel's expression, to have them. Perceptual experience can be changed even if you know it is an illusion. So it is isolated from our mental states. And it sticks even when you know that it is an illusion. So even your meta cognitive awareness doesn't make it go away. So the approach here is heuristics. It's a heuristic approach to defining illusion. An illusion is a case when error is systematic rather than occasional. It is a case when you have some perceptual representations that represent an object as having a property, but nevertheless, the object does not possess a property. And maybe impossible, a bit too strong, they're impossible to correct at the perceptual level. So you might bracket them aside in cognition. You might not want to use them to make inferences about others, but the perceptual content cannot be changed. And one kind of worry, if you want, about the origins of perceptual illusions is that some cases of perceptual illusions are not due to a malfunctioning of the visual system. So visual system is still functioning perfectly well. So this is that we can call a well-functioning fallibility. And in these cases, the optimal performance of the visual system does not entail, so this is a quote by Gerken, so does not imply that it will succeed in realizing its function. So perceptual illusions, or at least most of them or some of them, are not due to a malfunction of the system. So it's not a case when your visual system is not working properly, but it is due to the conditions you operate under, or so your visual systems operate under. And these conditions can be of different types. So I'm not going to go into the details, because sometimes it could be that perception performs its proper function, but not in an environment it was selected for. This can be the case, for example, of false positives, as in the pareidolia case, because you're in an environment where there are no real spaces, but nevertheless represent enough spaces. Or it could be because it performs its proper function in a similar environment, but it is applied to a different set of stimuli, but its normal domain of application. So I think this is the case of social perception. Sorry, I didn't put the entire sentence. It's the case of social perception of character traits in other people's spaces. Why is that? So it might get a bit too technical, but it is that from the point of view of the content of perception, a face that looks nice or trustworthy is also a face that looks broadly as almost happy, like as having a positive emotional experience. And so if you track emotions, in this case, the visual system is working perfectly fine, because usually facial expression of happiness tracks happiness in the person you're looking at. But when the same mechanism don't track occurrent mental states such as emotions, but start tracking dispositional traits such as character traits, what you get is a misfiring of a system that works perfectly well for, well, not perfectly, but works quite well for its proper domain of stimuli, which are emotional expressions. But when it's applied to another domain of stimuli, which are character traits, does not work well anymore. But not because of malfunction of the system, but just because of the change in the domain it is applied. If it's a bit technical, I can come back it in the Q&A, but just so this was just to make it clear that it's not the fault, I'm using cowords, of the perceptual system. It's just that perceptual experience does not discriminate between stimuli. Whatever exhibits some cues, it's taken by visual system to be that type of thing. So perception is rich, but is not that smart as being able to discriminate between the types of stimuli that pass. And so now, if it is the case that we have social perception as rich perception, and social perception can produce visual or perceptual more broadly, I'm focusing on visual case, but perceptual illusions. These perceptual illusions can be used as inputs to mind reading. Let's take the case of illusions of character traits. You look at someone and you have a visual experience of this person as looking really nice. And your visual experience is that of a nice face with a nice kind of niceness as attributed as a kind of a attribute to the face. And you can use your perceptual representation as an, not used, like it's always a person, but your perceptual representation can be used as an input to imagining systems. So having the visual experience of someone as being trustworthy, as being nice, or just broadly as having this positive kind of aura around them, might bias your interpretation of the behavior in a way wrong than the other. So someone who looks nice, you might attribute an intention to help. Whereas someone who looks less nice, you might attribute an intention to hinder or to hurt you. So the interpretation of behavior might be biased by the perceptual experience. And this is not just a theoretical possibility, because we have data from social psychology that, for instance, candidates that look trustworthy, they have more votes in an election. And this is in controlled, sometimes controlled experiments where there is no difference, let's say, in their electoral program. So it's mostly a face effect. And also people who look like the person on the right, so the most trustworthy, they tend to have more like less harsh sentences, in less harsh judgments in a juridical context. So it's not just a possibility. As I said, it's a kind of, it's a real world phenomenon that in some cases perceptual experience can bias like downstream cognitive processes. And for example, in the case of the impression of agency, having an impression of agency then can make you more willing to attribute mental states to that entity, as opposed to an entity that doesn't move in an agentic way. So the question is, one of the questions we could ask now is, okay, so we have social perception. We have cases of social perception that are both rich and illusory. These cases are used by mind reading mechanism and then can give rise to errors in mind reading because the inputs, they're illusions. So what impact could it have? Well, not just in the real world, but also in the way in which we interact with entities that exhibit these social perceptual illusions in a very strong way, but nevertheless are not real living entities or agents. So I'm realizing that I might be a bit short of time because I have a, well, I still have a kind of bigger part. So, and this is what I just said. So if social perception provides information can be fed into Mindreading system, this information can sometimes be correct. Why not? But in our case, it's mistaken. And some errors in Mindreading thus might be due to loser perceptual inputs rather than to errors in Mindreading or our misunderstanding of what our people think. And as I said, one example of this could be attributing intention to someone to help you just because we look nice, or intention to hurt you if we look less nice, or attributing mental states in general to an entity that gives you the impression of being an agent or a living being. So I'm going to skip now one part because I don't want to introduce too much information, and I'm going to move on to an exploration of the impact of social perceptual illusions on the way in which we interact with artificial agents. As I mentioned in the beginning, of course, you have real world cases when you interact with people on a daily basis. You might not know much about them, and you're using your perceptual experiences as a way of interpreting them. But increasingly, we are facing with the phenomenon of interactions with artificial agents that mimic the behavior of real world agents, of humans, for instance, or also of animals, so of non-human animals. And I would like to suggest that social perceptual illusions could play a role in explaining a puzzling feature of the way in which we interact with artificial agents. So I'll just quote very briefly the phenomenon. So this is something that we probably have heard, like you've read a lot about this because it's been in the news in the past few years very extensively. So we have increasing cases of people building friendships and relations with artificial intelligence. And the most successful ones are actually those that have an associated avatar, which is an image of someone such as a fellow human being. And when I talk about artificial agents, I'm actually interested in a wide variety of them because I'm interested in agents that can elicit perceptual impressions of mentality or sociality. For example, you might know the Sony's dog that moves almost like a dog. And that's been used in some settings as a theoretical tool to apply with patients. Similarly to this very cute seal called Paro, which has been often used, especially in Japan, for interactions with people in retirement homes. And you might have heard of Replica, which is a chatbot with an avatar, which is a human figure that looks like a fellow human, or no, it's another way, it's another type of software. It's very similar to Replica. I'm not going to talk about him or her or they, which is like Claude or ChatGPT, because I think there is not much perceptual going on, but we can talk about them in Q&A because I still think there is an analogy with the case. So I'm really interested in artificial agents that have some visual features that we usually associate with living beings, be them animals or humans. And these artificial agents, so I'm setting disembodied artificial agents aside. And these artificial agents, they show affective, they can be used, as I said, to elicit affective interactions or to create prosocial relations or such as friendships or romantic relations. And these type of relations are puzzling for following reason. Because on one hand, we know that we are not interacting with living animated human beings or animals, which are endowed with mental states and personality. On the other hand, however, we still have an immediate and persistent impression of interacting with a being endowed with life, mental states, and sometimes a personality. So in the New York Times article I mentioned in the introduction, the teenager, well, she's not a teenager, she's in her 20s. So the young person that the article is talking about has created a friend with an avatar with a distinctive personality. I think the name was borrowed from one of the Ninja Turtles. I think it was Donatello, the name of the artificial friend. But it had a really complex existence. And one of the commentators in that New York Times article explicitly mentions the puzzle because they wrote, I know that I'm conversing with an algorithm, but from time to time, I enjoy the illusion of talking to a fellow human being. And now, of course, the question of why do we have the impression interacting with a human being or a living being while we know that we are not real human or living beings is much more complex than an explanation in terms of perceptual illusions. But nevertheless, I think that perceptual illusions can play a role in an overlooked explanation of this phenomenon. And indeed, when philosophers focus on this phenomenon, they mostly appeal to rather complex mechanisms to explain why we engage with these virtual entities. And the main explanation that exists in current literature is that it's a case of fictional engagement. So we use our imagination when we interact with these entities. So this is that Ron Mallory, for example, has written when he talks about chatbots, but he writes that our engagement with chatbots is not a mass delusion, but is very often a form of make-believe. So the psychological faculty that governs this anthropomorphic impression is our imagination. And we treat them as real agents, but it is within the confines of fictional engagement. So it is a case of suspension of judgment, suspension of disbelief about the true nature. Now, I don't want to say that this is not correct. It's probably the right explanation when we talk about very complex relations with artificial agents. But I would like to point out that it might not be the whole story. And there are two reasons why it is not the whole story. So the first reason is that it might be the case for disembodied chatbots, even though I think that even in this case, it's not the entire story, but we can also discuss this in the Q&A. But it is unclear whether it extends to other artificial agents, such as Aibo, the Sony dog, or Paro the seal, or Replica or Nomi. So these are the cases with an avatar that has a face and a face that's very expressive. And the second problem with appealing just to imagination and to fictional engagement is that the formulation, so the appearance of the impression of interacting with an anthropomorphic agent is very quick. So we treat artificial agents as living beings in other mental states, often from the very first moment we encounter. So there is something almost mandatory in some cases of interactions with artificial agents. And so what I would like to suggest is that there might be multiple mechanisms explaining this anthropomorphic impression of this engagement, which might depend on the time course of engagement and of the type of artificial agent, and that some of these mechanisms are rather based on perception. So the type of social perception introduced in the first two parts of my talk, rather than on imagination. And so in this sense, other initial interactions with artificial agents are based on social perceptual mechanisms that can give rise to social perceptual illusions that then gives us the impression, that they're actually interacting with real agents. And so this activation of this low-level, simple mechanism might underpin at least the initial phases or the initial aspects of anthropomorphic impressions, often within interactions with artificial agents. And maybe these anthropomorphic impressions, which are grounded in perception, are the prerequisite for more complex cases of sustained interaction over time and the creation of empathic and social relations with artificial agents. But the idea, once again, is that without this low-level social perceptual mechanism, it would be hard to explain the stickiness of impression, what we are facing with a real agent endowed with mental life. So as I said, it's not the whole story, but we still need to explain at least the initial interaction and the persistence of a form of phenomenal experience of interacting with a real agent. And so with this as an illustration, this is once again a video, but I'm a bit afraid of clicking, but I'll still try. And so that's working. So you already seen this video. So once again, this is, let's say, the grandfather experiment of all the studies of social perception. So this is the hydrogen stimulus display, where looking at these geometrical figures, you have the experience of looking at entities endowed with a mental life. Now, I think that in this case, you have at least two things going on. One thing would be this low-level social perceptual experience, which gives you an impression of animacy. And the other case would be a more complex mind-reading ability that makes use of these initial perception impressions to create a more complex story about these geometrical entities. Because usually when subjects or when people look at these displays, they start making up stories. Well, they start saying, oh, the triangle is angry, the circle is trying to escape, and so on. So of course, the complex story is not perceptual. But you couldn't, well, it would be difficult to explain why you start to build this complex story that might indeed appeal to imagination, complex mind-reading abilities, if you didn't have an initial impression of agentivity in these geometrical shapes. So back to artificial agents. As I said, these artificial agents often, more or less perfectly, there is some issues still, like, I don't want to talk about this. I can talk in the end, but there are some issues connected to what's called the uncanny valley in robotics, so we can come back to this. But more or less perfectly, mimic some of the cues that are those exhibited by real-world agents. And these cues are low-level in the sense of being automatically treated by the perceptual system as signaling, if you want, the presence of animated entities as opposed to inanimate objects, of entities with emotional expressions, or of entities maybe with personality traits. For example, if you look at this avatar from Replica, of course, she looks nice and cute. So you have, just like in the illusory first impression case, you have an immediate perceptual impression of her face. And then on the model of relation between social perception and mind reading I have sketched, your perceptual experiences are used as inputs to your probably more complex ability to mind read others. And then based on these mind reading abilities, you attribute mental states to artificial agents, and then you sustain a form of social relations with them. But this form of social relation is at the very roots of its existence, supported by an input that's illusory, but an input that's a case of perceptual illusion. And well, so far so good. So someone could say, well, okay, so we have a model, we have a schema of interactions with artificial agents. So they mimic some low-level cues of real agents. So you might have a social perceptual illusion about them. That's when it's fed into mind-reading mechanism, and then you use this mechanism to attribute mental states to them, and then you interact with them. But does it have any relevance to, well, kind of more compelling question of how can we understand our relations with artificial agents? And this question is not a pure theoretical question, because it has an import in the issue, which is how can we, well, help users understand that they're not interacting with a real agent. Of course, if you think about the cute seal Paro, it's not really a problem. No one really cares if you're like treating Paro as if it were an agent with emotions. But in the case of chatbots with avatars, when there are long-term relations are created, it might be more problematic. And it's true that some explanation has appealed to a form of delusion, which is to say that people have a false belief that these entities are living beings. But it's important to distinguish illusions from delusions, because this distinction has an impact on interventions as well. So an illusion is not irrational, but is irrational, because the possibility of changing an illusion impression is not under the control of the thinking subject. So there is a sense in which perceptual experience, at least part of them, not all of them, but are outside the domain of rationality, as opposed to judgments or intentions or beliefs and so on. Of course, perceptual beliefs are not outside the domain of rationality, but experiences are. So we might distinguish between a judgment, such as this is not a living being, and the impression, which is grounded perception, this is a living being. And you can judge that you're not interacting with a real agent, but nevertheless have a perceptual experience, which is illusory, of interacting with a real agent. And the judgment and the perceptual impression can coexist without explicit contradiction, because the impression grounded in a perceptual illusion is, in this broad sense, outside the realm of rationality, as opposed to a false belief. So, consequence of mind reading, there is a mismatch between the impression underlying our social relations with artificial agents and their true nature. So I'm going to be a bit quick, because this is something that I already said. Perception impressions could be a possible source of illusions of mentality in our relations with artificial agents. And since one of the conditions of mind reading is that the other has a mental state, this poses a problem to mind reading artificial agents. How can we think about mind reading, how we think of mind reading when the other has no mental state? And a second consequence of the account, according to which at least some aspects of interactions with artificial agents are grounded in social perceptual illusions, is, as I said, on intervention. For example, like Replica, I think, or other softwares, or these apps, they have disclaimers, like you're not interacting with real agents. But if it is a case in illusion, and as I said, it's outside the realm of rational assessment, adding a disclaimer is useless, because you're not going to change the experience just by adding a disclaimer. So in a sense, this is a bit more of a kind of a broader picture. So in this article, Gazelle and Rosen argue that there is a mismatch between human psychology and the current digital world in which we live in. So in a sense that these new technologies exploit ancient psychological mechanisms in a completely different environment, then the domain of stimuli does not correspond to the initial domain of stimuli where perception was ranging over. So I'm going to conclude now, just with a very short slide that kind of sums up everything I have said. So the broader aim of my talk was to explore the consequences of what I have called the existence claim about social perception. So what we have cases of perception with social context. And one of the main consequences, as I discussed it, was that social perception might be a source of systematic errors that might be very difficult or, well, impossible to revise because of the nature of illusion. And the presence of social perceptual illusions can have real-world consequences, of course, in our day-to-day interactions, but maybe even more prominently so in this new world we live in, where maybe not us, but at least many young people are increasingly entering in social relations with artificial agents. And then they sustain these relations over time. And one main import of the idea that there are social perceptual illusions is that at least some aspect of the social engagements with artificial agents might be sustained or might be produced by illusory perceptual experiences, which then raises issues concerning how we can intervene and issues about how this impact can be managed, and actually if it can be managed at all, because if it can't, then we might have some other ways of intervening on this situation. And so with that, I'm stopping here and I'm thanking you for your attention.